Have you ever considered what the word eternal means, or a parallel term, everlasting? As we move into book 4 of the Psalms, we transition from what appears to be more reflections from the perspective of exile, from the perspective of those being separated from God and longing to be back in fellowship with Him, to a consideration of how God's movement and presence among His people has significant implications. And in Psalm 90, we begin that reflection. You can see that I have outlined or called attention to a concept that is very important in Psalm 90, and that's this idea of what eternity means, and particularly who is the eternal one. And you can see here how Moses, which is interesting in and of itself, this is way prior to the exile. Moses reflected about God's character, his everlasting nature, and how that applied to God, perhaps an encouragement to those who had been separated from God for such a long time, to remember who He is and how He has existed from eternity. And so in this psalm, there is a contrast between the everlasting nature of God, as pointed out in these phrases that I have surrounded by rectangular boxes, to the temporary nature, the transitory nature of we as God's created people, as the world itself has been created, is not everlasting, but only an extension of what God has made and created. The Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, as I have pointed to over on the right-hand side, draws attention to such a contrast. And in that context, he's speaking about those who have rejected the testimony of God through His Son, Jesus Christ, how they will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the Lord's presence, as you can see that particular passage states. And in Psalm 90, a similar contrast is being drawn, so that the writer of this particular psalm, who is representing his people, the people God has chosen, realizes the transitoriness of his own life, of their own life, in comparison to the everlasting existence of the one and only true God. And in that light, Psalm 90 then continues to reflect about how that should affect their thinking and their perceptions. In the passage there in 2 Thessalonians, you can see the very dark, so to speak, outcome for those who have rejected Jesus Christ. It's difficult sometimes for us to grasp this idea that God is a God of wrath, but yet we see that expressed in Psalm 90. But that's not the only story, because or the only part of the story, because you can see also, as expressed here in 2 Thessalonians, that as he points out, those who have received the gospel and who do believe will not be shut out from the presence of the Lord, but will exist in His presence. And so in Psalm 90, the writer reflects upon his brief existence, their brief existence. Again, notice the idea of God being a God of wrath and who displays His wrath throughout the course of their lives. We see this expressed here on the left-hand side in the NIV version, but I have shown also the ESV Bible translation, how it also expresses, perhaps in similar but a little bit different words, the idea that God indeed is a God of wrath, and that in our brief life, this applies to all people everywhere, we exist under that kind of existence because of our sins, how they have separated us from the one and only true God. And yet God's wrath is not the end word. The psalm writer here in Psalm 90 asks for the Lord's blessing, that during his transitory time upon the earth, God would indeed rest his favor, not only on him, but notice upon us. He speaks for the people. This points to his recognition that he's completely in need. They are completely in need of God's favor, his grace to come upon them so that his wrath would not destroy them. Reflect back upon the passage that I just pointed to in 2 Thessalonians. Paul gives them hope. He reminds the believers in Jesus Christ that yea, though we do have troubles, yea, though God's wrath is displayed every day because of sins, because of the sins of the world, because of our sins, those who have placed our faith in Jesus Christ have been forgiven of our sins. And so we, like the psalm writer here, we can pray this prayer, recognizing that, yea, in Jesus Christ, we don't exist under God's wrath, even though God's wrath is displayed each and every day because of God's favor, because it rests upon us, because we can ask for God's favor to rest on us. We can ask him that he will establish our work, our existence, our purpose for the short time that we indeed do have on this earth before Christ would return. So I ask you, have you reflected upon God's everlasting nature, his eternal existence? It's an amazing concept. It's an amazing thought. And it can drive you crazy if you try to figure out how one could exist from everlasting to everlasting. But it nevertheless shows and reminds us that God is of a different character, a different nature than we are, and that it is only because of his favor that we can even exist. He owes us nothing, nothing. Each and every day he owes us nothing. But yet if we ask for his favor, if we remember that we exist because of his grace and because in Jesus Christ, we are able to experience his blessings, then perhaps, like the psalm writer, we might take one step towards praise and thankfulness for what God has done, what he will do, and what we can look forward to because of what he has promised in Jesus Christ.